Ma'am, those twins are living with me. Helen Carter froze, the two small yellow flowers slipping in her trembling fingers as she stood beside a gray granite headstone. Her husband Frank had his arm locked around her, more anchor than comfort, because 3 years after losing their baby boys, Ethan and Luke, the grief still hit like a sudden wave. Every Friday, same cemetery, same silence. Until that thin, deady voice cut straight through it. Behind them stood a girl of about 10 sun-browned skin bare feet, caked with dirt hair tangled like she'd been running from the world. She pointed at the framed photo on the grave as if it were a door she could open. Frank's eyes narrowed, angry and confused. "What did you just say?" "I said they're in my house," the girl repeated. "They're not in there. They're alive. They live with me in Hope Ridge." Helen's knees went weak. Her mind screamed impossible, but her heart didn't listen. The girl Maya pulled out a cracked old phone and swiped to a blurry picture. 2 little boys playing in a simple room. Helen leaned in, breath caught, seeing familiar eyes through the grain. Then Maya added details no stranger should know. One boy's star-shaped birthmark, how they always slept wrapped around each other. Listen, if you're watching this, imagine the air in that moment, heavy, electric, terrifyingly hopeful. Helen looked at Frank, and without needing words, they both knew. Whatever was buried here might not be their sons. Frank tried to scoff, but his voice betrayed him too tight, too careful. "A blurry photo doesn't prove anything," he said, even as his hands curled into fists at his sides. Helen didn't answer. She stared at the cracked screen the way a drowning person stares at a rope. Maya watched them like she'd been waiting for adults to finally believe her. She shifted her weight on those dirty bare feet and lifted her chin. "The quieter one, Luke. He's got a mark right here," she said, tapping the center of her own chest. "Like a little star. And at night, they don't sleep apart. Never. One hooks his arm around the other like he's scared the world might take him again." Helen made a sound that wasn't quite a sob, wasn't quite a laugh. Her fingers flew to her mouth, and her shoulders shook as if the words had punched through her ribs. That birthmark, Helen had kissed it 100 times. That sleeping habit, she used to tease them about it, calling them her little magnets. No one outside their family had ever known. Frank's face drained of color. He leaned closer to Maya, as if proximity could make truth easier to swallow. How would you know that he demanded, but the anger had cracked, revealing something raw underneath? "Because I take care of them," Maya said simply, like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. "For 6 months. They showed up crying, calling for their mama and daddy. At first they wouldn't eat, now they do. They're 3. She paused, eyes flicking to Helen's face. "They're the same age they'd be, if they're yours." Helen's breath hitched hard. The cemetery suddenly felt too small, too loud, too alive. She reached toward Maya, not to grab her, not to scare her, just to touch the sleeve of that filthy shirt as if grounding herself in something real. "Take us to them," Helen whispered. "Please." Maya didn't move right away. Her eyes darted past them, scanning the rows of headstones like someone expecting trouble to step out from behind the marble. "You're not going to call the cops, are you?" she asked, the bravado in her voice wobbling at the edges. Frank lifted both hands, slow and open. "No police. Not today. We just want to see them." Helen nodded, swallowing hard. "And if they're ours, we're not leaving you behind." That landed. Maya's shoulders loosened a fraction, and she gave one sharp, decisive nod. "Okay, but you follow me. Don't do anything sudden." They climbed onto a packed city bus that smelled like exhaust and wet clothes, the kind of ride where knees bump and strangers avoid eye contact. Helen gripped the metal pole so tightly her knuckles blanched her breath, coming in short, uneven pulls. Outside the window, the city thinned buildings, giving way to patched roads, then to dusty streets lined with small homes that looked like they'd been built from whatever people could find and keep. Maya talked the whole way like she needed the words to stay brave. "I found them in an abandoned van near the bus terminal," she said, staring at her own bare toes. "They were hungry, crying. Nobody came. So I took them." She said it like it was simple, like bringing 2 toddlers home was the same as picking up a lost puppy. "How did you feed them?" Helen asked, voice cracking. "I collect cans and cardboard," Maya answered. "At night I bring food, sometimes diapers. Mrs. Eliza, she's old, but she watches them when I work. She taught me how to make bottles, how to wash them." Helen turned her face toward the window so Maya wouldn't see the tears slipping down her cheek. Frank slid his hand into hers, and for the first time in 3 years, Helen felt something beside grief, something dangerous and bright hope. The bus hissed to a stop, and Maya hopped down first like she was afraid courage might evaporate if she waited. Helen followed with legs that didn't feel like her own. Each step through Hope Ridge was a heartbeat, fast, loud, unforgiving. The road was packed dirt. The air held the scent of cooking oil, sun-warmed metal, and something sharp that reminded Helen of survival. Maya led them to a small shack, patched with wood and tarp, but it was cared for like someone had tried to make dignity out of scraps. In front, a garden of colorful cans held stubborn green plants. Maya pushed the door open and lifted her chin. "Ethan, Luke," she called, voice turning suddenly soft. "Your big sister's back." Frank went rigid. Hearing those names out loud here felt like stepping into a dream that could shatter if he blinked. 2 little boys burst into view. One ran straight for Maya and wrapped his arms around her legs like he belonged there. The other slowed, hanging back with wide eyes, studying the strangers with quiet caution. Helen's hand flew to her mouth. The world narrowed to their faces, the curve of a cheek, the shape of an eyebrow, the exact shade of their eyes. They were older, taller, but unmistakably hers. Helen lowered herself to her knees, careful, slow, as if sudden movement might scare them away forever. "Hi, sweetheart," she whispered, voice trembling. Tears streamed down her face without permission. The bold one, Ethan, tilted his head, curious, as if trying to match her voice to a memory he couldn't quite reach. The shy one, Luke, shifted behind Maya's hip, half hidden. "Who are they, Lulu?" Ethan asked, tugging Maya's shirt. Maya's throat bobbed. She glanced at Helen and Frank, silently asking for time. "Friends," she said, gently. "They came to visit." But Helen couldn't look away. After 3 years of mourning a grave, she was staring at breathing living proof, and she could barely breathe herself. Maya kept the boys close. One hand resting on Ethan's shoulder, the other brushing Luke's hair back like a shield. Helen noticed it, the way Maya's fingers moved automatically, the way the boys leaned into her touch, as if she were the safest thing they knew. It should have been beautiful. It was. But it also broke something open in Helen's chest. Frank cleared his throat, forcing calm into his voice. "Maya, when you found them, did you ever see anyone looking for them? Anyone who came back?" Maya's eyes narrowed, searching her memory, like it was a street map she'd had to memorize to stay alive. "Not at first," she said. "But before that, before they ended up in the van, I saw them with people. Once, a nice-looking lady, older, white hair styled neat. She had a fancy purse like the kind you'd never see around here." Maya swallowed and pointed toward the road as if the scene were still parked there. And a man with her. Tall. Thin. He didn't talk. Just opened the car door. Helen felt Frank's fingers clamp around her hand so hard it hurt. She looked at him, and saw it in his face, recognition that didn't need words. "Was it a black car?" Frank asked, voice suddenly low. Maya nodded. "Yeah, shiny, like a mirror." Helen's stomach turned. She could picture it too clearly, the polished black sedan, the smell of expensive perfume, the click of heels on tile. And one face rose up from the memory like a ghost stepping into light, Vivian Hawthorne, Helen's own mother, always immaculate, always in control, and never once comfortable with the idea of two babies at once. Helen's breath came out in a thin, shaking line. "Maya," she whispered, barely able to form the words. "If you saw her again, would you recognize her?" Maya didn't flinch. She met Helen's eyes and said, steady as stone, "I'd know her anywhere." Frank didn't say another word until they were outside the shack, where the afternoon light hit like a spotlight, and there was nowhere to hide from what they'd just heard. He walked a few paces into the little dirt yard, then turned back, jaw-tight eyes bright with something that looked a lot like fury. "Helen," he whispered, like speaking louder might shatter her. "Your mother didn't want those boys." Helen shook her head hard, almost violently, as if she could shake the thought loose. No, Vivian wouldn't." Her voice cracked on the last word. She pressed her palms to her temples, breathing fast, the world tipping under her feet. Frank stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Think back. After they disappeared, who kept saying, 'Stop searching'? Who told you to accept it when you couldn't even stand up straight from grief?" He paused, watching her face. "Who handled your paperwork when you were medicated and barely sleeping? Who insisted you sign things because it's easier if I take care of it?" Helen's stomach rolled. Images flashed Vivian's manicured hand, sliding a pen into hers, Vivian's calm smile, while Helen's hands trembled Vivian's soft, certain voice. "You need to move on, sweetheart." Back then, Helen had mistaken control for care. Inside the shack, the boys' laughter drifted out like a cruel miracle. Helen wrapped her arms around herself, blinking hard. "Why would a grandmother do that?" she asked. But it came out small, like a child asking for sense in a storm. Frank's eyes went cold. "Because she thought she knew better than we did." Helen swallowed, tasting metal. Somewhere behind them, Maya hummed softly to settle the boys. Frank reached for Helen's hand again, steady and firm. "We don't rip them away tonight," he said. "We do this right. But tomorrow—" He looked toward the city, toward polished buildings and polished lies. "Tomorrow I'm going to see Vivian." The next morning, Frank stood in front of Vivian Hawthorne's high-rise, like he didn't belong there, work boots on polished marble, grief still stuck under his ribs. The doorman's smile faded when Frank didn't smile back. Minutes later, Vivian opened her door in a silk robe, perfectly composed, until she saw Frank's face. "Well," she said, a practiced sweetness in her voice, "this is unexpected." "We found Ethan and Luke." Frank answered, no greeting, no warmth, just the truth, like a blade. For a split second, Vivian's expression cracked. Color drained from her cheeks, and her hand tightened on the edge of the doorframe as if it might keep her upright. Then she recovered, lifting her chin. "Frank, you need to stop doing this to Helen. It's cruel. They're gone." "They're alive," he said, stepping closer. And a little girl from Hope Ridge described the woman who took them. White hair, designer purse, black car, a tall, thin driver. Vivian blinked too fast. Her lips parted, then pressed into a thin line. "You don't understand," she whispered, turning away like the skyline could rescue her. Helen was falling apart. "You were never home. Those babies were too much." "So you stole them!" Frank said, his voice trembling now, not with fear, but with rage he'd been holding for 3 years. "You forged papers. You drugged your daughter into signing things she didn't even know were there." Vivian's shoulders sagged. "I found a family," she said, barely audible. "A wealthy family. They wanted twins. I thought, God help me. I thought it would be better." And then Frank pushed, jaw clenched. "What went wrong?" Vivian's eyes glossed over. "They changed their minds. At the last minute, my driver panicked. If we went through the system, there'd be records, questions. So he left them. In a van. Like trash. Frank's breath came out harsh. A 10-year-old child loved them harder than you ever did. Frank didn't leave Vivian's condo until her perfect world looked shaken. Hair slightly out of place, hands trembling around a crystal glass she hadn't even sipped from. He leaned in just enough to make sure she heard every word. "You're going to fix this," he said, quiet but iron strong. "You're going to help us get our boys back legally. You're going to pay for every attorney, every doctor, every piece of paperwork. And you're going to tell me everything you know about your driver, where he went, who he talked to, all of it." Vivian tried to summon her old power, but it came out thin, and if I don't cooperate, Frank's eyes didn't blink. "Then I go to the police. I go to the media. I tell them how you used your connections, how you slipped documents in front of a drugged, grieving daughter, how you left 2 toddlers to be found like abandoned luggage." His voice tightened. "You don't get to protect yourself anymore." Vivian's shoulders collapsed, the fight finally draining out of her. She nodded once, small, defeated. "I'll do it," she whispered, as if the words tasted like shame. Frank walked out with the weight of it pressing on his spine. Outside, the city felt too bright, too normal. He sat in his truck for a moment, hands on the steering wheel, breathing through the burn in his throat. The hardest part wasn't confronting Vivian. It was going home. Helen was in the kitchen when he opened the door, folding tiny shirts she'd bought on impulse soft cotton, new tags still on them, like her hands were trying to rewrite the last 3 years stitch by stitch. She didn't look up right away. "How was it with my mom?" she asked, voice careful, already bracing. Frank crossed the room, took her hands, and felt her pulse racing under his thumbs. He swallowed once. "Helen," he said gently, "I need you to hear the truth. All of it." And as he began, he watched her face change hope, breaking into shock into fury like a storm rolling in over open water. Helen didn't cry at first. She went still too still, like her body had decided it couldn't afford to break yet. Frank's words sat between them on the kitchen table. Heavy and ugly forged papers, a better family, an abandoned van. When he finished, the only sound was the soft tick of the clock and the faint rustle of those tiny shirts under Helen's fingertips. Then her breath hitched. She pushed back from the table so fast the chair scraped the floor. Her hands flew to her mouth, eyes wide and glassy, as if she were staring straight through the wall and seeing the past, every moment her mother had helped, every signature, every gentle command to stop searching. Anger came next, rising hot in her throat. "I want to see her," Helen said. Her voice didn't shake. That scared Frank more than tears ever could. "Helen." He reached for her, but she stepped away, wiping her cheeks with the back of her hand like the tears were an inconvenience. "No, I need to look her in the eye. I need her to hear my voice." She swallowed hard, jaw tightening. "And I want Maya there." Frank blinked. "Maya. She deserves it," Helen snapped, then softened the fury, cracked by something tender. "She carried our boys when no one else did. She fed them, washed them, held them through nightmares, while my mother sat in silk and called it the best." Helen's eyes burned, but her posture stayed straight, controlled. Maya should see the face of the person who nearly destroyed her life, too. Frank nodded slowly, realizing this wasn't just confrontation. It was reclamation. "All right," he said. "Tomorrow. Together." Vivian Hawthorne opened the door before they could knock twice, like she'd been standing on the other side listening for footsteps. Her eyes flicked from Frank to Helen, then landed on Maya. And for the first time, the woman who always looked untouchable actually flinched. "This is the girl," Helen said, voice calm, in a way that felt dangerous. She didn't step inside right away. She made Vivian stand there, framed by her expensive hallway like a portrait of power with a crack running through it. "Look at her. Really look." Vivian's mouth opened, searching for a script. "Helen, honey?" "No." Helen cut her off with one clean syllable. She turned slightly toward Maya, lowering herself just enough that Maya didn't feel small. "Tell her what you did. Tell her how you kept my sons alive." Maya's shoulders rose with one steady breath. She met Vivian's gaze without blinking. I found them crying, she said. They were hungry. They kept calling for their mom and dad. So I worked. Every day. I picked up cans, cardboard, whatever I could sell. Her hands moved as she spoke small, precise gestures, like she was tying knots that had held her world together. I learned how to make bottles, how to bathe them. When they had nightmares, I stayed awake and rubbed their backs until they stopped shaking. Vivian's eyes slid away as if shame had weight. And you know what? Maya continued, voice sharpening. They're happy kids. They laugh. They play. They don't know you tried to get rid of them because I made sure they felt loved. Helen watched Vivian's face crumble piece by piece, and then leaned in. You're going to make this right? Helen said, each word quiet and absolute. You'll sign whatever needs signing. You'll pay whatever it costs. And after that, you will never touch my family again. The days that followed were brutal in the quietest way. No screaming headlines, no instant happy ending. Just paperwork waiting rooms and the slow, careful work of rebuilding trust. Frank and Helen didn't rush the boys. They stayed in Hope Ridge, renting a small place nearby, so Ethan and Luke wouldn't feel like their whole world was being ripped up again. Every morning began the same Maya tying their shoelaces, smoothing down Luke's hair, packing a little snack in a worn backpack like she'd done 1,000 times. Helen watched it all with a tight throat. Gratitude and heartbreak sat side by side in her chest. At night, when the boys finally fell asleep, still curled together, still clinging to the only rhythm they knew, Helen would sit on the edge of the bed and whisper their names like prayers. Sometimes Ethan would giggle in his sleep. Sometimes Luke would flinch, then relax when Maya's hand found his back. Maya became the bridge. Uncle Frank and Aunt Helen love you, she'd tell them while they played in the dirt yard. They loved you when you were tiny babies. Ethan would squint up at Frank, testing him. Luke would study Helen's face like it was a puzzle. Then one afternoon, the question finally came sharp and simple, the way little kids cut straight to the fear adults avoid. Are you taking us away from Lulu? Ethan asked, gripping Maya's shirt. Frank crouched down until his eyes were level with theirs. His voice came out rough, honest. We don't want to take you from her, he said. We want us all to be together. Luke's brows lifted. All of us, he whispered. Helen looked at Maya, and for the first time, Maya's brave mask slipped just enough to show how much she'd been afraid of being left behind. That night, the air in the rented house felt different, less like a temporary shelter, and more like a test of whether a family could be rebuilt without breaking anyone. Luke woke first, a small whimper turning into full sobs. He sat upright, shaking eyes wide, as if the dark had teeth. Maya was already there, rubbing his back in slow circles, whispering, It's okay, I'm here. Helen stood in the doorway, frozen by a truth that hurt her son reached for Maya by instinct. But then Luke's gaze found Helen, really found her, and something in his face softened like a memory trying to surface. He lifted his arms toward her, shaky and unsure. Helen crossed the room in 2 steps and gathered him up, feeling the weight she'd been robbed of for 3 long years. Nobody is taking Lulu, she whispered into his hair. Not from you, not from us. Frank appeared behind her with a mug of warm cocoa, kneeling beside Ethan's bed, as Ethan blinked awake, confused, then comforted by the normalcy of it. Maya didn't look jealous. She looked relieved, like she'd been holding her breath since the cemetery. Helen met Maya's eyes over Luke's shoulder and nodded once, a silent vow. Not rescue, not charity, belonging. Family isn't just who you're born to, it's who shows up, who stays, who protects you when it costs something. And sometimes the strongest love comes from the smallest person in the room. If you were, Helen, could you forgive a betrayal like that? And if you were Maya, would you have been brave enough to take 2 toddlers home? Tell me in the comments, I read them all. And if this story moved you, Hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter of heart and hope stories we share here.